Following the Americans' Apollo program, which put men on the moon, NASA, the American space agency behind it, soon turned toward the next generation of space travel, a way to make it more sustainable and subsequently cheaper. The idea was to build a reusable rocket capable of doing multiple space flights while also transporting large amounts of cargo. The thinking was that if NASA could design a large enough cargo bay, they could attract private and military contracts that would pay big money to use their routine missions to send cargo into space. This might have been so lucrative that the program may have reached a net positive in cash flow. This was also under the assumption that the program would make up to 60 launches a year, making them almost routine. By 1972, the program formally commenced, and this made the Soviet Union worried. Since the 1950s, they too had been interested in developing reusable spaceplanes. They did so under their own state-owned agency called the Soviet Space Program. And just like the Americans, they were under the belief that a reusable spacecraft would be cheaper and more efficient than single-use rockets. But as NASA inched closer to fleshing out their space shuttle program, the Soviets became increasingly worried that not only had the Americans asserted their superiority in the space race, but that this next generation of space developments would be used for military deployment. The Soviet Union thought the space shuttle was going to be capable of transporting large amounts of cargo to space that could be used for antagonistic or defensive purposes. This would certainly give America and its allies the upper hand during the Cold War. They thought that NASA would be working alongside the state military to send up space lasers and other weaponry for testing, while also setting up capabilities to launch nuclear weapons faster than any land-based method. But at the same time, the program was already hugely expensive for NASA, and the Soviet space program's scientists and engineers didn't really see it as the future. But Moscow fears were high, and with political along with military encouragement, they put the development ideas into motion, first with engineers studying what the Americans had already built with their program. It was 1976, and despite the USSR not really even knowing how their space shuttle would be used, particularly for military applications, there was enormous political pressure to just match the capabilities of the US. After various design alterations and compromises, this is what the Soviets came up with. They called it the Buran, a delta-wing spacecraft designed to reach space riding on the Energia, a super heavy lift launcher in its own right, with a hydrogen-oxygen core stage and 4 liquid-fueled boosters. The shape and configuration of the entire Buran was obviously heavily derived from the American shuttle design. Though the Energia Buran stack did have some important differences, and even some advantages. The orbiter itself, for example, didn't have the same type of main engines, meaning it was overall lighter and cheaper, while also still allowing for the same payload capacity. The avionics were also very different from the American counterpart, so much so that the vehicle was capable of autonomous atmospheric flight, including automated landings. The Buran program was impressive, but there were still issues with the program. NASA's orbiter design was still more aerodynamic and was further along in development. It had an overall level of refinement and focused on human pilots rather than automation. In April of 1981, the Columbia, NASA's first space shuttle, would launch successfully, beginning a whole new era of space travel and setting up the shuttle program for the Americans for years to come. This was all while the Soviets were also racing to take flight with their program, and after much international speculation, the Soviet Union finally brought their shadowy program into the light. The first orbiter, officially named 1K and adorned with the name Buran on the side, had started construction in the early 1980s. It was now being transferred to a launching site in what is now known as Kazakhstan, at the spaceport Baikonur Cosmodrome. The Soviet shuttle was fully fueled and mounted to launch pad 11037. Finally, after nearly 2 decades of development, the Buran 1K lifted off on November 15, 1988. However, it wasn't carrying any astronauts. This was a test flight and a showcase to the world, so the Buran would only make it into low Earth orbit, make 2 passes around the Earth, and then return home. Since there were no crew on board, the vehicle would be operating autonomously, ultimately landing back down without incident. The launch was an incredible success, and overall, it was a pretty impressive test and showcase of what the Soviets had been working on, and this seemingly marked the beginning of a vibrant future for the program. A year later in 1989, the program was expected to take another test flight in 1991, though the actual launch dates of this would change from year to year, with nothing set in stone. They would ultimately lay down a roadmap for up to 8 future missions, with actual crew flights taking place in 1994. However, this was all happening in a critical time for the Soviet Union. While the prestige of their efforts were being broadcast to the world, the nation was in trouble. Political willpower began to wane for the program, while scientists and engineers weren't even all that enthusiastic on the Buran anyways. After all, it was significantly more expensive to launch the Buran rather than a more conventional rocket. As the Soviet Union saw a new leader with Mikhail Gorbachev, funding had been drastically reduced, leaving 2 orbiters that were under construction left unfinished. As the Soviet Union itself began to fall, the program was left in shambles, with funding withdrawn completely by June 1993. While there was no formal cancellation, the project no longer had the political support or money, meaning much of it was frozen where it was. It had been 22 years since the program began, and while an exact number could not be determined, it's estimated that over 20 billion rubles had been spent on the program, one which now had no future. Over the following years, the Buran program had been both figuratively and literally dismantled. While there were various test orbiters and other vehicles built, the program had built only 3 mission-ready orbiters. 1K, which was the only one to actually be completed and saw spaceflight, 2K, which was around 95% finished, and 3K, which was around 30% finished. This was while another 2 were under construction. They were 4 and 5K, and following the end of the program, they were mostly taken apart and scrapped, though some remnants do still exist. The Buran, or 1K, was kept intact, shown publicly at air shows and exhibits over the years, sometimes even displayed on top of the Antonov AN-225. It would ultimately be stored in a large hangar-like building within the Baikonur Cosmodrome facility called MIK, more specifically being placed in the MIK RN building. It was placed in there in 1998 and stacked with the Energia test article. While Kazakhstan was now its own independent country, no longer part of the now dissolved Soviet Union, Russia inked a deal to retain ownership of the important spaceport. It was and still is the largest spaceport in the world. But despite the Russian government operating the sites, these massive buildings spread across the desert had been long neglected of maintenance. The results of this were disastrous, after construction materials and heavy rainfall collected on the roof of the MIK RN building. On May 12, 2002, the roof of the MIK building had collapsed, falling in on the Buran spacecraft, as well as killing 8 workers. The Energia rocket and the original Buran, the only one to actually make it to space, were completely destroyed. What was left of the vehicles were then cut up and scrapped, while the building was partially repaired, though the rest of it would just be left to the elements. Even today, the roof of the building is still left wide open. In another hangar-like facility called MZK, the second orbiter, 2K, also known as Pichka, had been placed there in 1995. It was situated alongside a prototype orbiter called OK-MT, an engineering mock-up which was never capable of flight. 1995 would be the last time these vehicles would move, and as Russian space efforts moved away from the Buran project, the tangible relics of that era were sort of just forgotten about. Through this time, the ownership of the spacecraft was also put up in the air. Russia had ultimately sold them to a Russian-Kazakh company by the mid-2000s. Photos from around this time showed the orbiters in a state of isolation, with the buildings surrounding them slowly starting to fall into disrepair. While the orbiter and its engineering mock-up were ultimately sold to a private Kazakh businessman, the public fascination with the Buran program had always lingered. Despite the Cosmodrome still being an active Russian spaceport, people began charting a massive trek to get inside the remaining buildings on the site and capture what was left. Photos would go viral in 2015 showing the abandoned spacecraft slowly decaying within the massive hangar. These photos would spark a whole new world of curiosity, with more and more people looking to make the ultimate urban exploration adventure. One such photographer was Chris Luckhart, who made 2 separate trips to see the craft, and he knows all too well about the perils of getting there.
I've heard it being referred to as the Everest of abandoned places. It was just a lot of logistical planning and trying to figure out how to do this and how to get my feet into that building and see the space shuttles. So It's 37.5 kilometers, which is what I had routed out for the first trip. So, essentially a round trip of about 75 to 80 kilometers, 50 miles for American listeners. To do it, we arranged to start at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and then hike through the night, thinking it would take about 12 to 15 hours, get there before sunrise, get into the building, and then sleep and be undetected by any of the patrols. The theory being that the patrols weren't running at night. It's a spaceport, an active spaceport, and essentially you're trespassing into Russia.
Within building MZK, mostly everything that was left there in 1985 remains there to this day. Offices with files and computers give reminders of the Soviet era this building had been constructed in, while the infrastructure of the building itself is a reminder of the operations as a refueling and construction facility. But the real star is what's been left on the ground level. The OK-MT and Pichtka are largely left intact from when they were first built. However, they too have started to slowly decay with natural aging. This is alongside human intervention like the broken windshield, scrapped interiors, and missing heat shield tiles. The space that it's contained in now is in stark contrast to how it was designed. Originally a facility designed as a clean room. Obviously, that has changed now. All of this has now been caked over in a layer of dirt, dust, guano, and paint chips. Debris also litter the area, while the towering rusty walls and holes in the roof provide some light and airflow. The unique geography of the area, it being located in a desert, does help the amount of water damage in the building. You can only imagine what this would look like in a more humid climate. But still, it's been almost 30 years since the building has been put to use. And over that time, everything inside has slowly succumbed to Mother Nature.
Every step, there's a crunch because there's so much debris has fallen from the ceiling. And there's junk scattered around. Scrappers have been going in there for years, so there's broken pieces here. The truck has been stripped out that's in the back corner. The overall design and architecture of walking around in the offices really felt like Cold War era Soviet Union from what I saw in photos and the videos and the propaganda that we would have seen back in the day.
Today, much of Area 112 has been left in ruins. Massive buildings dot the landscape totally abandoned. Chris described it to me as looking like a war zone, like a bomb had gone off with concrete, steel, and even rocket parts littering the desert. In more recent times, and following the Russian-Ukrainian war, security has tightened on the site. And after a 2021 graffiti incident where the Pichtka orbiter had been vandalized, a renewed focus has been put on the property. The vehicle's owner has since painted back over the graffiti with white paint, and while there have been talks of moving the spacecraft to a museum, as of today, nothing has been announced, nor have the vehicles been moved. But that's not to say you can't see a Buran program spacecraft on display. While other mock-ups, like this wooden wind tunnel model, also sat abandoned for years, there are a few test vehicles on display around Russia. Though perhaps the most accessible one is at the Technik Museum in Speyer, Germany. Along with their really cool exhibits of a Lufthansa 747 and a Russian AN-22, they have an actual Buran test vehicle. This one was named OK-GLI, and it was built in 1985. After various legal battles, as well as a brief display in Australia, it ended up here in Germany. As for the other 5 original orbiters, only one still exists today in public view, that being 3K, which was originally slated to have the first crewed missions to space in 1984. Of course, that never happened, and while it was in rough condition over the years, it was recently moved to a new site within Russia for public display. In the end, I think some people see the Buran program as something akin to a strange parallel universe when compared to the American program. And while the Soviets did largely build off of what NASA had already created, the program was still cutting edge. And whether that was due to a need to create a perception of strength, to bolster their military capabilities, or a genuine interest in science, the Buran program will always be a technologically impressive showcase of what humans can achieve. It's a really important part of history, especially space travel history. Regardless of the political intentions, thousands of hardworking scientists and engineers not only built out a massive space program, but also created a rivaling spacecraft to the Americans, in some cases even outperforming their Western counterpart. And they proved to the world that they could do it in 1988. They even showed it was possible to fly it without a human crew on board.
They spent a lot of money for no real end use, ultimately. What a monumental waste. All of that amazing science and engineering gone.
But despite these efforts and the billions which had been spent on the program, the legacy of the Buran is largely known by what's left in the abandoned spaceport. Not only is it a pretty apt metaphor for the fall of the Soviet Union, but also as one of the most incredible abandoned places in the world.